Chapter 3. Pat Stevens knelt there a long time looking down at the murdered man without moving. In his turbulent past he had seen much of violent death, had stood looking back at many a murdered man, but he had never been made sick by the sight before. Never before had he been forced to endure the sight of a man belonging to his best friend protruding from the back of a corpse. Far stronger than any other emotion, as he stood there, was the helpless feeling that he could have prevented this tragedy less than half an hour ago. Though it seemed inconceivable that Fred Ralston could have known this was waiting for him at the Jewel Hotel, it was also just as apparent to Pat that his death was, somehow, the result of the mysterious plan that had brought him to Powder Valley from Denver. A plan that required the services of a new sheriff, and of which Pat could have simply stopped by declaring himself to Ralston in the lean-to office. Pat drew in a deep breath and jerked his thoughts back to the present and pressing emergency. Here was a dead man, and there was Sam Sloan's knife sticking in his back. If Sam had wielded that knife, Pat knew the smaller man would have had a good reason for striking. But why wasn't Sam here to take the consequence of his act? Why was Ralston laying here alone in his hotel room in the pool of his own blood? Pat drove himself swiftly into action as various possibilities of answers to the questions came to him. He hurried to the hall door of the death room and tried the knob. The door was locked. He went back into Ralston's room and closed the door gently and found a key on the inside of the door. He turned the key and then went back into the adjoining room. Obviously a woman's bedroom. There were several glittering gowns hung in one corner behind a curtain, and there was a dainty, feminine toilet articles neatly laid out on top of the boudoir. A framed picture on the bureau caught Pat's attention. Though he had seen Kitty Lane only once, he knew it was a photographer of the hotel hostess. There was no evidence of any struggle in the room. Two rocking chairs stood close together, nearing the curtained window, with a small table between them. There was a tray and a bottle of whiskey and two glasses on the low table. The bottle was less than half full. Around the edges of the tray were burnt-out butts of brown paper cigarettes. Sam always rolled his smokes with brown paper, and the cigarettes were smoked down to very shorts, as he always smoked his. Pat Stevens moved around the room slowly. He pretended he was looking for a clue, though inwardly he was admitting he wouldn't recognize a murder clue if one rose up on his hind legs and snapped at him. Besides, what would he have need with a clue? The whole story of the murder was told in that hunting knife. All he had to do was find Sam and arrest him. Thinking of that put a sour taste in Pat's mouth. There was still plenty of killing in the West, and Powder Valley wasn't so civilized that men didn't fight and die occasionally, and there was no thought of arrest. But a knife in the back was a different matter. And right here, in a lady's bedroom. Pat stopped his aimless wandering to stoop over the corpse and stared down at it broodingly. Ralston lay belly downward on his left side. His right leg was drawn up and his right arm was outflung. His eyes were closed and he looked completely at peace. Pat knew what he had to do long before he did it. He stood there pretending he was trying to make up his mind, trying to justify himself. Well, all the while he knew he was going to have to hide that damning evidence against his best friend. He stooped and gingerly took hold of the initial bone-handled knife. It didn't come loose when he pulled at it. It was as though the lifeless clay of Fred Ralston resented his effort to dislodge the death weapon, as though the dead man was determined that it should stay there as mute evidence against Sam. Pat took a tighter hold and wiggled the knife back and forth. The dead flesh released its hold reluctantly, and it came out suddenly. Pat held it away from him and let the blood drip on the floor, and then carried it over to the washstand and wrapped the knife in a thin hotel towel. He lifted his pants leg and dropped the wrapped knife down inside his boot, and then shook the cloth back down again. He went back into Ralston's room and closed the door behind him and felt his way to the hall door in the darkness and then unlocked it. He took the key out, and after he had gone through the door and closed it, he locked the door on the outside, dropped the key into the pocket on his leather shirt vest together with the derringer that he had taken from Joe Dem's. The door along the hall were still closed. As far as he knew, no one had seen him go in or out of the Denver man's room. He didn't think he had been in there for more than 10 minutes altogether. He got out his bandana, mopped his face as he went back to the stairs, the wizened clerk leaning on his counter, and gave Pat a toothless grin as he came down.
Was Sam and Ezra in their rooms?
Pat shook his head. He stopped in front of the counter. When did you see them last, Forley?
A little after dark, I reckon. Ezra went up to his room first, and then Sam went up.
Tom Forrest snickered.
Sammy was putting 3 steps on every stair, with mighty purty lady he was pinning along with him.
Was it Kitty?
That's right. Seems like Kitty sure does cotton to that measly little partner of yours, Pat.
Has she come down since?
No, not by the front stairs leastways. Mighty used the back, though. She does that a fair bit.
Pat turned around and looked on the floor where he had last seen the hotel proprietor. Where's Dems? Tom Forrest cluckled loudly.
He come and carted him off for repairs. Mighty nigh cracked the back of his head, I reckon, when you jerked him down. Why was she so dead on keeping you from going up and seeing Sam, Pat?
That is something that I'd like to ask Dems himself. He lifted his head and stared through the glass door leading into the saloon. Noticing his look, the clerk nodded.
Yeah, that's her, all right. Mighty purty singing, if you ask me. I guess she must have come down from upstairs by the back way after all.
Pat nodded, went towards the glass door through which he could faintly hear a clear soprano voice singing Annie Laurie. When he opened the door, Kitty Lane's limpid, beautiful tones came out clearly. She stood on a little dais on the end of the room, accompanied by the accordion playing by a plaid-faced youth with a limp butt of a cigar drooping from his lips. Pat stopped in the doorway and looked over at the singer. Kitty Lane was no longer young, but she was still beautiful. Her body had lost the slimness of youth, but was softly rounded, swelling at the bodice and hips of long, tight, shimmering dress of yellow material that swept down to her feet. Her cheeks were delicately rosed, and her lips were quite red, yet she managed to wear the artificial clothing without being really conspicuous. Her gown was cut quite low in the front, showing a smooth neck and creamy white shoulders and the beginning curve of a full bosom, yet it did not so appear immodest on Kitty Lane. Her hair was the color of ripe wheat, coiled about her small head in a heavy braid, and she wore long red earrings which hung almost to her bare shoulders. Her gaze caught Pat's as she started on to the last chorus of her song, and he thought she gave a little start of recognition, but her tone didn't falter. He stood watching her gravely until she finished singing, yet she did not look at him again. Men crowded about her as she stepped down from the dais and applauded loudly and called for more, but she brushed past them, smiling and gay, and came across the saloon towards Pat. He took off his hat and walked forward slowly to meet her. Kitty's curved her red lips upward in a gay smile as they met in the center of the saloon.
It is the sheriff, isn't it?
She clasped her hands in front of her and demurely lowered her eyes.
I've wondered whether I was going to get a chance to meet you.
Pat said, I missed a lot by not coming around sooner. She flirted her eyelids up at him, then laughed and took his arm.
I know you're a married man, Sheriff Stevens, but I hope that won't keep you from buying me a drink.
He replied, It sure won't, ma'am. And he went with her to the secluded table in the rear corner, where he drew out a chair for her and then took the one opposite of him. Kitty Lane rested her bare elbows on the table and cupped her pointed chin in her palms. Her eyes were a clear, deep water, like the waters of a mountain lake that was high up in the Rockies.
Maybe I shouldn't be calling you, Sheriff. You're not wearing your badge tonight.
No, I'm not. He reached in his pocket for cigarette papers and tobacco. A waiter came to the table, and Pat asked, What'll you have, ma'am?
Bourbon, please.
And Pat told the waiter, Make that too. When the man was gone, Kitty asked,
What is the name of the man who is sheriff in your place? Somebody pointed me out to him the other night. He's not nearly as handsome as you, though.
Pat felt his face getting hot. He wasn't used to having pretty women tell him that he was handsome. He wondered if she told Sam that as well. You mean Jethro? She nodded and said,
I guess so.
As though it didn't matter. She held out her hand as he finished licking a cigarette.
May I roll one?
Pat gave her his makings. He vaguely wondered why he wasn't shocked as he watched her slim fingers deftly roll a cigarette. Somehow Kitty Lane didn't seem at all wild, and even though she wore rouge with a low-necked dress, smoked cigarettes, and drank whiskey with a man. He brought his thoughts back to the dead man upstairs in her room and asked, Have you seen Sam lately? She was absorbed in her cigarette and didn't look up.
About an hour ago, I guess.
Her fingers tore the flimsy paper. She made a grimace and started to roll another. Whereabouts? This time she did look up. The blue of her eyes were deeper now, almost violet.
Upstairs?
She hesitated, her voice softened.
I helped him to his room.
Pat asked curtly, Was he drunk?
A little bit.
She licked her cigarette. He's drinking a lot these days, isn't he?
He's drinking too much.
Kitty Lane's voice was suddenly tired. She leaned forward with the tightly rolled cigarette between her lips to get a light from his. Her eyes held his as the tips of their cigarettes touched. She drew back, drawing in a deep breath and expelling a cloud of blue smoke through her crimson lips.
You could talk to him, Pat. He'd listen to you.
She put her hands on his arm.
You don't mind if I call you Pat, do you?
No. The waiter then came with their drinks. I do want to have a talk to him, Pat told her roughly. He's not in his room. You know where he is? She shrank back from his tone and shook her head slowly while she looked down at her cigarette.
He isn't in his room?
Well, if he is, he's locked in and passed out, Pat greeted. How many drinks did he have in your room after you went upstairs together? He asked bluntly. The color fled from Kitty's cheeks, leaving 2 round spots of rouge.
Do you think I have a drink with men in my bedroom?
Don't you?
No.
She stamped her foot on the floor.
You men are all alike. Just because a girl works in a saloon, you think she's a...
Pat replied harshly. What's Fred Ralston to you? Kitty Lane pushed back her chair and stood up. She leaned forward and slapped Pat, leaving the print of her fingers on his face, sobbing loudly.
Damn you! That's for your insult.
Half the men in the saloon had been watching interestedly ever since Pat and Kitty had gone over to the table together. Now there was a concerted movement forward, and a low mutter as they drew their own interpretations of Kitty's actions. One youth pushed forward from the rest as Kitty whirled about from the table with her head held high. He was Dan Peters. He was young enough to be Pat's son, with a cowlick and with the soft down of an unrazored beard on his cheeks. He wore high-heeled Spanish boots with a shiny gun belt strapped tightly about his young waist. He had enough liquor in him to make him foolish, and he was cowily in love with Kitty Lane.
"What's he doing, Miss Kitty?"
Dan muttered thickly. He swayed a little on his high heels as he tried to strut forward. Kitty sobbed.
"Oh, Dan, he said the most awful things to me. Make him stop." "You bet I will, Miss Kitty," the young puncher promised drunkenly. He faced Pat, and his voice crackled in embarrassing falsitude as he demanded, "Get up on your hind legs, Pat Stevens, and crave for the lady's pardon."
Pat gave a snort of disgust and glared at the boy. "Go blow your nose, Dan, and keep out of men folks' business." Someone at the bar snickered loudly. The sound infuriated Dan, drove the last semblance of sober sense from his mind. He slapped his hand down on the butt of his 6-gun and tugged at it awkwardly. Pat kicked his chair back and started towards him. "Don't be a fool, Dan. Let go of that gun." Dan got a thin sneer on his lips and began to curse Pat. His gun came loose unexpectedly, and he triggered it as it came upward. A bullet tore into the floor 3 feet to Pat's right and 10 feet behind him. He lunged forward and got hold of Dan's gun, gave him a shove back into the crowd, and ordered calmly, "If he's got any friends here, you better take him up and sober him up." He broke the gun, threw the cartridges out, and then tossed the empty weapon at Dan Peters' feet. He walked over to Kitty Lane's side and took her arm firmly. "We're going upstairs to your room." End of chapter 3.